Hi there, I'm Mrs F, and this is my lesson on controlling and influencing attitudes. I'm following the Edexcel specification, but a lot of the content is also relevant to other exam boards. So, last time we finished looking at how the Nazis created a police state and controlled the legal system. In today's lesson, we'll look at how they controlled and influenced attitudes using propaganda and their control of culture and the arts. You might remember Joseph Goebbels, the man on the right-hand side of the screen. We came across him in an earlier lesson when Hitler made him the Nazi Party's head of propaganda in 1930 and got him to coordinate his election campaigns for the presidency in 1932 and the Reichstag elections as well. Now, when the Nazis came to power, Goebbels was made the Minister for People's Enlightenment and Propaganda, and I think this really shows the importance that Hitler placed on propaganda, that he made a whole government department dedicated to it. So in this role, Goebbels coordinated policy towards the media, sport, culture and the arts using censorship and propaganda. Now, censorship is where you control attitudes by banning vehicles for delivering information, like newspapers, pictures, radio or film. And propaganda is when you use those same vehicles for information to create attitudes by putting ideas into people's minds. Hitler had a very simplistic view of propaganda. He thought it was just a matter of constantly repeating the Nazi message, but for Goebbels it was more complex. He said that the finest kind of propaganda does not reveal itself. The best propaganda is that which works invisibly. And we're going to have a look at some of the different examples of propaganda that Goebbels created. Something that I want to point out right at the start, though, is that propaganda was much more successful in reinforcing existing beliefs, but was less successful in getting people to accept new ideas. Now, if you think of young children, they're going to be much more susceptible to propaganda, and that's why the Nazi Party put such emphasis on young people. But as people get older and they've already formed their opinions, they're less likely to change their minds. For example, if I showed you an anti-Jewish propaganda poster, that's not going to suddenly make you anti-Jewish, if you see what I mean. So, looking at the different types of propaganda that Goebbels created, we're going to start off by looking at newspapers. Something that I'd really like to stress if you get a source in an exam paper, which is a German newspaper produced after 1933, you've got to treat it with a lot of caution because there was no free press in Nazi Germany. Any newspapers which opposed Nazi views were closed down. And in just 1 year alone, 1935, 1,600 newspapers were shut down. Secondly, what you need to know is that there was censorship. Journalists were told what they couldn't publish. So, for example, a Ministry of Propaganda order from 1935 said, "Photos showing the Reich government ministers at dining tables with rows of bottles must not be published in future. This has given the absurd impression that members of the government are living it up." So there you go, being told not to show the Nazi Party members having a good time. The newspapers were also used for propaganda. Journalists were giving regular briefings, containing only information that the government were willing to release. And sometimes they were given direct instructions what to write. Here's an instruction given to the press in September 1939 by the Ministry of Propaganda. In the next issue, there must be a lead article featured as prominently as possible, in which the decision of the Führer will be discussed as the only possible one for Germany. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Goebbels had already started to use the power of the radio, which was a modern invention for the time, in Nazi election campaigns. And after 1933, he censored radio stations and used them to broadcast Nazi propaganda. So, all radio stations were put under Nazi control, and Hitler and other officials made frequent broadcasts. Cheap, mass-produced radios were sold to the public and placed in cafes, factories, and schools. Sometimes speakers were even placed in the streets. By 1939, 70% of German homes had a radio, which was more than anywhere else in Europe. But all of these radios were designed to have a short range, so they couldn't pick up foreign radio stations where people might find information the Nazis were trying to hide. Goebbels had also used mass rallies and parades in election campaigns for the Nazis. And now that he had the entire resources of the German state at his disposal, he made rallies and parades bigger and more frequent. And one example is the mass rally that was held in September each year at Nuremberg, which was designed to create a sense of German unity and to show the strength of the Nazi Party in Germany. For example, at the 1934 Nuremberg rally, which Hitler had his favourite filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, film so that it could be broadcast across Germany, there was a stadium with a giant eagle with a 100-foot wingspread, thousands of swastika banners, surrounded by 130 anti-aircraft searchlights with a range of 25,000 feet, which shined into the sky and formed walls of light around a crowd of 200,000 party supporters waving 20,000 flags. Goebbels also Nazified sport. For example, sports stadiums were covered with Nazi symbols so that people's enthusiasm for sports was linked with enthusiasm for Nazism. And Goebbels insisted that all teams, including visiting teams from abroad, must make the Nazi salute during the German national anthem, to show that sports stars were paying respect to the Nazi state. And in that shocking picture at the bottom, what you see is the England football team giving the Nazi salute in May 1938. Hitler's biggest opportunity to use sport as propaganda was the 1936 Berlin Olympics. The Nazis built the largest stadium in the world, which could hold 110,000 people. And all the events were very well organised to show Nazi efficiency. The fact that Germany won 33 gold medals, more than any other country, was used by the Nazis as propaganda to show the superiority of the German race. Art became very boring during the Nazi period because they objected to all the amazing modern art movements that had sprung up during the time of the Weimar Republic. They preferred cultural activities which stressed romantic ideas about Germany's past, like country life and strong families, and also Nazi ideals like loyalty, struggle, self-sacrifice and discipline. So in September 1933, they set up the Reich Chamber of Culture to make sure that cultural activities were consistent with Nazi ideas. In the picture, you can see an exhibition called Degenerate Art, which opened in Munich in 1937, displaying works which the Nazis said were an insult to German feeling. Under the Chamber of Culture, the Nazis set up a Reich Chamber of Visual Arts, and all painters and sculptors in Germany were required to apply to be members. If you didn't have membership, or it was taken away from you, you were forbidden to teach, produce, or sell art. In 1936, over 12,000 paintings and sculptures were removed from art galleries, including work by famous artists like Picasso, Cézanne and Van Gogh. The Gestapo would make surprise visits to artist studios to check that rules hadn't been broken. And to encourage the kind of art that they approved of, competitions were held with large prizes for the winners. And the kind of painting they did approve of is the one that you see on the right, called The Führer Speaks, which shows a family listening to a radio broadcast by Hitler. The Nazis disliked the modernist and futuristic architecture of the Bauhaus movement that we looked at in a previous lesson. Hitler's favourite architect was Albert Speer, and he designed many of Nazi Germany's major buildings, building the parade ground for the Nazi rallies in Nuremberg and the offices for the Chancellor as well. Speer used design features to help Germany seem powerful. He built huge buildings so that size gave the impression of power and permanence. He also used features like domes, arches and pillars from ancient Rome and Greece so that the buildings seemed grand and historic and to lend them the idea of legitimacy. And he decorated his buildings with massive Nazi flags, partly for artistic effect, but also to show the powerful impact of the Nazi Party. The Nazis also tried to control the performance and composition of music in Germany. Some types of music were censored. For example, jazz music was banned because it was seen as the work of black people and therefore inferior. They described it as degenerate. That's the word that you see on that poster there, which is also, of course, very racist in its depiction of a black person. The work of Mendelssohn was also banned because he was partly Jewish. Some music was promoted because it emphasised parts of German culture which the Nazis liked. For example, Richard Wagner was favoured because he put to music the legends of heroic and powerful Germans from the past. And Beethoven, Bach and traditional German folk music was also favoured. The Nazis had strong ideas about literature and which books should be available to the German people. No new books could be published without approval from the Chamber of Culture, and existing books containing views which the Nazis disapproved of were censored. 2,500 writers were officially banned. Millions of books were taken from universities and public libraries and burned on huge public bonfires like you can see in the picture. In May 1933, students in Berlin burned 20,000 books written by Jews, communists and anti-Nazi authors, destroying books by Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein, amongst others. And that quote that you see at the bottom of the screen is now featured on a memorial to this event in Berlin. The quality of much German culture was very poor. The exception was film, where high-quality work was produced, particularly by Leni Riefenstahl, who I mentioned earlier. Her documentary called Triumph of the Will, which showed the 1934 Nuremberg Rally, and her film of the Berlin Olympics called Olympia are recognised for their quality, even though, of course, the subject matter is rather darker. Now, all filmmakers had to send plot details to Goebbels for approval. And can you imagine this? Before you even got to watch a film in a cinema, you had to watch a 45-minute propaganda newsreel. The Nazis also made about 1,300 of their own films. Some of them were obvious propaganda, like Hansi the Canary that you see in the picture. He was based on Mickey Mouse, but as you can see from that lick of hair across his forehead, he's meant to look like Hitler. In the film, Hansi is pestered by villainous black crows with stereotypical Jewish features. But even films made for entertainment had underlying political messages, like Hitler Junge Quecks, produced in 1933, showed a young member of the Nazi Party being killed by communists.